The first call came in at 12:14 a.m., just as Officer Jack Monroe was about to clear a stop on Route 68. A shaken driver on the other end of the line swore he'd just passed a little boy walking along the shoulder in the dark, clutching a backpack, no adults in sight. 2 minutes later, another 911 call. Different driver, same stretch of highway, this time describing a girl in a long coat, bareheaded in the night air, standing near the guardrail. By the time Jack pulled his cruiser up on the mile marker both callers mentioned, the lane was empty, the shoulder bare, just the steady rush of semis and the low hum of his engine. As soon as his dashcam turned toward the spot they described, his radio erupted in a burst of static and distorted voices, like a dozen transmissions layered on top of each other from different years. And just for a heartbeat, in the washed-out edge of his headlights, he thought he saw a small figure turn its head toward him before the frame went fuzzy and the shoulder appeared completely, impossibly empty. Officer Jack Monroe had been with the Maple Ridge Highway Patrol for nearly 12 years. He'd worked every kind of shift the schedule could throw at him. Blazing summer afternoons spent directing traffic around construction, icy dawns responding to rollovers, and the long, lonely overnight hours when most of the county was asleep and the highway seemed to belong only to truckers, insomniacs, and the occasional bad decision. Route 68 was his usual beat, a two-lane artery that cut through farmland and low hills, connecting the town to the interstate some 50 miles away. Jack liked the night shift more than he admitted. Less small talk, fewer supervisors hovering nearby, more space to think. He knew every reflector post along 68, every curve where deer liked to dash out, every faded roadside cross that marked someone's worst night. He'd been the first on scene to more than one serious crash over the years. Smashed bumpers, spun-out sedans, overturned pickups. He knew what it looked like when people underestimated speed, distance, and just how unforgiving a patch of asphalt could be. He also knew that when it came to kids on the highway, there was no such thing as overreacting. The Academy drilled that into them. Treat any report of a child on or near the roadway as a priority, even if it sounded strange, even if it came in garbled in the middle of a storm. You don't want to be the one who chalked it up to a prank, his field training officer had told him years ago. You respond, you look, you don't assume. At home, Jack had 2 kids of his own, a middle schooler who stayed up too late playing video games, and a 10-year-old who still left stuffed animals on the couch like little sentries. His wife, Claire, hated his overnights. You're out there when people are tired, when they've been drinking, when they can't see the deer until it's too late, she'd say. He always answered with the same line, that's when they need us out there the most. The radios at Maple Ridge Dispatch were the constant background music of his life. He knew the voices of every dispatcher by their opening, 10-8, you available? And every patrol unit by the way they clicked their mic. Static meant weather, interference, a hill between antennas. Nothing supernatural, nothing mysterious, just equipment and physics. Route 68 had its own stories, of course. Old-timers talked about the truck that had gone off the bridge back in the 70s, the family sedan that spun out before seatbelts were common, the school bus that skidded on black ice but miraculously never tipped. Roadside memorials became landmarks. Slow down before you reach the Wilson Cross, or watch the curve past mile 42 where the guardrail's still dented. Somewhere in those stories, if you stayed long enough, someone would mention the kid. A vague tale about people seeing a child on the shoulder late at night, walking alone, only to find nothing when officers arrived. Jack had always filed those tales in the same mental drawer as phantom hitchhikers and ghost stories traded over bad coffee. Until the night those 911 calls started coming in on his watch, with modern drivers, modern phones, and coordinates that dropped right onto his section of highway. The first night's calls went into Jack's log as unable to locate. He drove the reported stretch of Route 68 3 times, lights off except for his low beams, scanning both shoulders. Twice he pulled onto the gravel to walk the guardrail with his flashlight, breath hanging in the cool air as tractors sat silent in darkened fields. Nothing. No size 5 footprints in the dust, no dropped backpack, no child huddled by the concrete barrier. just the relentless whoosh of traffic and the insect buzz beyond the reach of his light. Back at the station, he reviewed the dashcam from that first run, mostly out of stubbornness. The footage showed what he remembered: his headlights sweeping the shoulder, the reflective posts ticking by. But about halfway between mile markers 42 and 43, the image flickered. For exactly 2 seconds, the picture smeared into a gray blur, and the audio track erupted in a distorted chorus of voices, half-formed words, overlapping transmissions, some using codes he hadn't heard since academy training. When the picture settled again, the road was empty. The blur didn't look like a person exactly, more like a smudge someone had dragged their thumb through. He took off his headphones and replayed the section twice more, leaning in. The time code on the screen read 001703. The clock in his cruiser had read 12:17 a.m. The second night, the calls began just after midnight again. A trucker on his way to the interstate reported a kid in a striped shirt walking along the eastbound shoulder, head down, arms at his sides. Jack was already rolling. As dispatch took that call, another one came in from a woman heading the opposite direction. A child in a bright yellow raincoat standing near the bridge, just staring at the traffic, she said, voice shaky. She swore she hadn't been drinking, swore she hadn't fallen asleep at the wheel. Age estimate, Jack asked over the radio as he accelerated. Both callers say, somewhere between 6 and 10, the dispatcher replied. Height around 4 feet. No visible adults. Last seen near mile 42. Same stretch as last night. He felt the familiar tug of duty tighten his muscles. This wasn't funny. Kids that size could dart into traffic in a second. Copy, he said. Show me en route. Advise other units to slow through that area until I clear it. As he neared the mile markers, he saw nothing but a long line of tail lights and the occasional flicker of hazard lights from a semi pulled into a turnout. He drove the stretch again, slower this time, eyes straining. No striped shirt, no yellow raincoat, no small figure silhouetted against oncoming lights. That's when the radio started acting up. 3-5, you copy? Another unit began, then cut off in a squeal of interference. The dispatcher's calm voice fractured into fragments, codes breaking apart mid-syllable. Jack tapped his mic. Dispatch 2-1, you coming through garbled? Say again? What answered him sounded like 10 channels talking at once, voices layered with faint echo as if bouncing off concrete. He caught his own unit number, then someone else's call sign he didn't recognize, then what might have been an old district designation, one that hadn't been used in years. He pulled into a wide shoulder near the bridge, flipped on his rear flashers, and sat for a moment listening. As soon as he put the cruiser in park, the radio cleared. Dispatch came through clean. 2-1, you still on my frequency? Affirmative, he said, unsettled. I had some interference. You getting anything on your end? Negative, the dispatcher replied. Comms look normal. We've still got those 2 callers holding. They both insist they saw a child. One says the kid had a metal lunchbox. The other says it was a modern backpack. Timestamps are 2 minutes apart. 2 people, opposite directions, describing details that didn't match but felt oddly specific, both using the same anxious phrase, a kid too close to the lane. Later that shift, back in the break room, Jack mentioned the calls to an older patrolman, Rick Dawson, who'd been on the highway detail since the late 80s. Rick took a slow sip of coffee and squinted. Route 68 around the bridge? He asked. Yeah, Jack said. Why? Rick shrugged, like he was deciding how much to say. When I first started, we used to get weird calls out there sometimes. Folks seeing a kid walk in the shoulder, always at night, never in the same clothes. We'd roll up and there'd be nothing. Dispatch logged them as possible pranks or misidentifications. One old sergeant used to say, that's what happens when a road remembers what it's seen. He snorted, shaking his head. I don't buy into that stuff, but it kept happening. Jack didn't like the way the room felt suddenly smaller. What about dash cams? He asked. Anything on tape? This was before cameras in every car, and when we finally got them, the calls kinda tapered off, or maybe we just stopped talking about them. He gave Jack a long look. Whatever you're dealing with out there, you still treat it like a real kid. That's the job. Doesn't matter how many times you come up empty. By the third night of calls, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Midnight to 1 a.m., same mile markers.
Different cars, different descriptions, same impression. A child alone where no child should be. Jack started the shift feeling more wired than usual, scanning the clock every few minutes as the hands crept closer to 12:14 again.
On the third night, the call came in right on cue. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked, and a breathless voice answered, There's a kid on the bridge. I almost hit them. I swear, there was a kid right there. Jack was already rolling toward mile 42, engine humming, light bar dark to avoid startling anyone on the shoulder. The dispatcher patched the caller's description through his unit. Subject described as small child, maybe 7 or 8, dark hair, wearing, caller says, old-fashioned clothes, overalls and a shirt with a big collar, no reflective gear. Copy, Jack said, jaw tight. I'm 3 minutes out. Keep them on the line if you can. Get any distinguishing features, shoes, markings, anything. Traffic was heavier than usual for that hour, a steady line of headlights stretching in both directions. As he closed in on the bridge, he radioed ahead. All units, reduce speed near 42. Possible child on the shoulder. I'll be checking the span. He killed his high beams, switching to low so his eyes could adjust. The concrete rails of the bridge rose ahead, ghostly in the half-light. That's when his dashcam flickered again, the screen on his console stuttering like someone had yanked the signal. The radio crackled, but this time it wasn't random noise. It was voices, old, thin transmissions breaking through like something had turned the dial back. He heard a unit number he didn't recognize. 68 Charles, en route to Juvenile on 68, a distant voice said, the audio warped as if it were underwater. Another voice overlapped it using an outdated 10 code. A third voice, young-sounding, cut across them with a high, panicked, I didn't see them, I swear, I didn't see, before the whole thing collapsed back into static. Dispatch 2-1, you copy that? Jack asked, heart thudding. Copy what? The dispatcher replied. All I got was your unit identifier. We're clear on this end. Before he could answer, his headlights swept the mid-span of the bridge, and there, on the narrow strip of concrete between the lane and the guardrail, stood a small figure. The child was facing away from him, toward the edge, head tilted down as if looking at the drop below. In the harsh glare of his lights, the details wavered. For a second, it looked like a striped shirt and a backpack. Then, as his car rolled closer, it looked more like overalls and a plain button-down. The hair length seemed to change with the angle, short, then longer, then tucked under something like a cap that might not have been there at all. His instincts took over. He hit his brakes, slammed the cruiser into park, and threw on his rear flashers. Dispatch 2-1, I have visual on the child. On foot, on the bridge. I'm making contact. Advise other units to slow down and watch for me in the roadway. He stepped out, the rush of passing vehicles roaring in his ears, and called out over the noise. Hey, it's the highway patrol. Stay where you are, okay? I'm coming to you. Don't move closer to the edge. The figure didn't turn. It didn't flinch at his voice or the sudden blaze of red and blue behind him. It just stood there, small and upright, shoulders slightly hunched. Continuing to call commands, he moved carefully along the painted line, keeping his body between the child and the lane as best he could, one hand out, the other free near his radio. I'm here to help you, okay? We're gonna get you somewhere safe. Tell me your name. He closed the distance to about 15 feet, his boots ringing on the expansion joints. The air on the bridge felt colder than it had any right to be in late summer. As he stepped into the direct glare of his own headlights, the child's outline seemed to shimmer, edges fuzzing like heat off asphalt. But there was no heat, only that strange chill. A semi thundered by in the opposite direction, its lights sweeping across the scene like a giant strobe. For a fraction of a second, everything flared white, the concrete, the rails, the child's small shape. Jack raised his hand to shield his eyes. When the glare passed and his vision cleared, the shoulder was empty. No child, no small figure, just the guardrail, the long stretch of road, and his own cruiser flashing in the dark. He froze, scanning frantically. Kiddo, hey, talk to me, he shouted, stepping right up to the rail, peering over at the dark ribbon of land and water far below. Nothing, no movement, no splash, no scramble of footsteps. The space where the child had been was bare concrete, dry and undisturbed. Dispatch 2-1, status? Dispatch asked. You still with me? He swallowed, forcing air into his lungs. Dispatch 2-1, I've lost visual, he said, fighting to keep his tone level. No subject on the bridge. I'm checking the span and surrounding area now. Stand by. He swept the entire length of the bridge 3 times on foot, then again in his cruiser, his dashcam recording every second. No sign of anyone, no small shoe prints in the dust, no dropped backpack, no coat, no child crouched in a recess beneath the structure. Later, unable to let it go, he went digging through the older filing cabinets at the station, paper reports from before everything was digitized. It took hours, but eventually he found them. Yellowed highway patrol notes from the mid-70s, handwritten incident cards describing multiple citizen reports of juvenile walking Route 68 near bridge, late night, no child found upon officer arrival. One card, dated 1974, described a small boy in overalls reported by passing drivers. Another, from 1982, mentioned a young girl in long coat seen staring over the guardrail. Each card ended with the same phrase in neat block letters, "Unable to locate."
Jack's official report on the incident read like any other highway call. Responded to multiple citizen reports of juvenile on Route 68 bridge. Upon officer arrival, no subject located. Area checked on foot and by vehicle. No evidence of pedestrian presence or distress. Likely misidentification or subject left scene prior to contact. He left out the details that didn't fit. The flickering outlines, the sudden chill, the radio broadcasting voices from decades-old call signs. In the days that followed, the story made its way around the patrol room anyway. Someone at dispatch talked. Someone else had heard the strain in Jack's voice over the radio. A few colleagues asked careful questions. "You sure it wasn't just a reflective sign you saw?" one suggested. "Bridge plays tricks with light at night," another offered. The more they tried to give him rational outs, the more unsettled he felt. He knew what misidentification looked like. He knew what his headlights did to road signs and guardrail tape. He knew that in that moment on the bridge, there had been a shape that did not belong to metal or concrete, a child-sized presence standing exactly where no child should be. He went back to the dashcam again, this time with a tech from communications in the room. Together, they watched the footage of that third night. At the timestamp matching his approach to the bridge, the image wavered. For a brief instant, there was a vertical smudge near the guardrail, something just barely different in tone than the dark rail and the road. When they advanced frame by frame, a few stills seemed to suggest small shoulders and a head tilted down, but digital artifacts could play tricks, and both men knew it. The audio was what made the tech's hands still on the controls. On the raw file, right where Jack remembered hearing the layered transmissions, the soundtrack filled with overlapping voices speaking in codes and unit identifiers the tech hadn't heard used in years. "That's not normal interference," the tech said quietly. "At least not the kind I know how to explain." They sent a copy to the State Communications Center. A week later, the official response came back. Audio anomalies likely due to multipath interference and archival data bleed during recent server migration. No cause for operational concern. A tidy explanation that mentioned software, not stuck spirits. The older paper reports bothered Jack more than the dashcam. Those long-ago officers who'd written "unable to locate" beneath descriptions of children on the bridge had been just like him, trained, skeptical, responsible for the driving public. They'd taken the calls, rolled their units, searched what they could. Then they'd gone home with questions they couldn't put on a form. He started looking at his own nocturnal calls differently. A stalled car on the shoulder, driver nowhere to be found. Maybe they'd gone to find gas. Maybe they'd been picked up by a friend. An unexplained patch of skid marks near that same bridge late one night. Might be nothing, might be something. The highway bore silent witness to hundreds of stories he'd never hear in full. At home, his sleep grew lighter. More often than not, he found himself awake just before midnight, listening to the quiet house, his gaze drifting toward the clock as it edged toward the hour when those calls tended to come. Claire noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Rough week?" she asked. He shrugged and lied. "Just busy." A few nights later, he got an alert on his phone from the patrol group chat.
Someone had posted a blurry dashcam still from another unit's run on Route 68, an indistinct smudge near the guardrail that looked just like the one he'd captured. The caption read, "Guess Route 68 still got its invisible pedestrians." The replies were a mix of laughing emojis and wary jokes. Jack didn't add anything. When his next schedule rotation came around, he saw that he'd been slotted for another 4-week block of nights on 68. He stared at the printout for a long moment, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. He'd always prided himself on being the guy who didn't flinch at assignments, who took the rough shifts so younger officers with babies at home could get more days. This time, his pen hovered. Then he walked into his sergeant's office, schedule in hand. "Any chance I can swap to days for a while?" he asked, aiming for casual. "Kids' schedules are changing. Would be good to be around in the evenings more." The sergeant looked up, eyebrows lifting. "You asking off nights? Never thought I'd see it." He studied Jack's face, and for a moment seemed about to ask why. Instead, he just shrugged. "We can probably make that work next cycle. We'll see who you can swap with." On the way out, Jack passed the bulletin board where they pinned reminders about safety campaigns and seasonal hazards. At the bottom, someone had posted a small printed card from a national traffic safety group. "Report what you see, even if it seems small, even if it seems strange. You could save a life." He stood there a second longer than he needed to, reading the words over and over.
In the end, the department filed the Route 68 incidents where they filed so many odd calls, under the category of things noted, responded to, and ultimately unresolved. The digital logs showed unable to locate juvenile for each night. The audio anomalies were marked as non-reproducible interference. The old paper reports went back into their cardboard box, tucked away on a shelf in the records room. No one convened a task force to investigate phantom children on the highway. There were enough tangible problems to occupy their time: crashes to reconstruct, intoxicated drivers to stop, storms to work through. Jack shifted to days for a while. Officially, it was for his kids, to catch more of their games and homework and chaotic dinners. Unofficially, it was also to put some distance between himself and that bridge under the cover of darkness. On morning patrols, he still drove over it, watching the river glitter below and the sunlight gleam off the guardrails. In bright daylight, it looked utterly ordinary, just another piece of state infrastructure. Every so often, though, he'd catch himself glancing at the shoulder, imagining a small figure there, backpack, raincoat, overalls, seen only in the periphery and gone when he turned his head. On those days, he'd tighten his grip on the wheel and focus on the flow of traffic. If he caught anything out of the ordinary now, he'd radio it in without hesitation. He'd always believed in taking calls seriously. Now he believed just as strongly in taking his own instincts seriously too. He started talking more openly with newer officers about the emotional side of the job. Not about ghosts or legends, that wasn't his style, but about the weight of unresolved scenes, the calls that didn't end with arrests or clear answers. "You're going to respond to things that don't make sense," he'd tell them. "Your job is to show up anyway, to check, to make sure that if there is someone who needs help, you don't miss them because the story sounds strange." With time, the Route 68 child became one more story in the informal lore of the Maple Ridge Highway Patrol, told in snatches over coffee or during slow hours. Some officers treated it like a cautionary tale about fatigue and perception. Others whispered about it with a shiver, as if the highway itself held on to echoes of something that had happened there long before. Jack never tried to define it for them. He just described what he'd seen, what he'd heard, and what the records showed. Nothing more, nothing less. He left room for people to draw their own conclusions. On the anniversary of that third night, he drove the bridge off-duty in his personal truck, windows down, late in the evening as the sun bled out behind the hills. He pulled over just past mile marker 42, hazards on, and walked back along the shoulder, feeling the rough texture of the concrete under his shoes. Cars hissed by, drivers unaware of the weight the spot carried in his mind. Near the midpoint, he paused and looked out over the drop, then down at the narrow strip of shoulder where he'd seen that small figure stand.
He reached into his jacket and pulled out a reflective wristband, one of the free safety bands the department gave away at school events. Without ceremony, he looped it loosely around a bolt on the guardrail and stepped back. It wasn't an offering exactly, more like a quiet acknowledgement of the calls, of the people who had reported what they'd seen, of the officers who answered without knowing what they'd find. A recognition that whatever the explanation, those nights had changed the way he viewed routine forever. Back in his truck, as the evening crept into full dark, he looked at the clock. 8:12, nowhere near 12:17. He smiled once, a small, wry thing, and turned the key. He might avoid the graveyard shift now, but he still believed in its core principle. Out there on the road, in the thin hours when most people were asleep, someone had to be willing to respond to the calls that didn't make sense yet. And whether the figure on Route 68 had been an exhausted driver's misperception, a glitch in layers of technology, or something that wouldn't fit in a manual, he knew that he had done what he was sworn to do. He had gone looking.
When you hear about a highway officer responding again and again to reports of a lone child on the shoulder, calls that end in unable to locate, footage that glitches, and old notes describing the same scene decades apart, what would matter most to you? Proving exactly what was out there, or knowing that someone kept showing up to look? If you were in Jack's place, driving that bridge after midnight with a voice on the radio telling you there's a child in harm's way, how far would you trust your training, your senses, and your gut when the evidence refuses to line up neatly? And in your own life, where do you draw the line between dismissing something as just a story and respecting that some experiences, especially at the edges of danger, might never come with an easy, comfortable explanation?